Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Positive Proof Podcast. I'm your host, Parmis Najmi, and I'm so glad that you're here. If you want to listen to more episodes like this one on self-improvement, mindset, and wellness, go ahead and hit that follow button to join the family. Before I get into today's episode, I just want to ask you guys for a quick and kind favor, and that is if you haven't yet left a review, I would absolutely appreciate if you could do so. It helps so much to build this podcast and help it grow so that we can increase the positive impact we make and just overall make it a bigger community. Also, if you are looking for daily motivation, follow me on Instagram at Positive Proof Podcast. I post daily quotes that serve as sweet daily reminders that I think you'll enjoy. And if anyone is wondering how to leave episode requests, you can actually send me your thoughts via the DM me your thoughts link in the description or via Instagram DM as well. Let's dive right in. If you're anything like me, conflict is one of those things that you've had to unlearn how to approach. And we're taught to either fight, freeze, or fix, to go loud, go silent, or over-explain. But rarely are we shown how to stay rooted in who we are while navigating tension with someone else. And that's what this episode is all about. We're not going to be diving into a typical conflict resolution toolkit today. There's really no step-by-step script in this episode and no surface-level communication hacks. What we're going to be talking about is deeper, and it's actually internal. And this episode is for the version of you that wants to stay self-respecting even when you're triggered. And it's for the woman who's tired of arguing to be right and is ready to argue with herself less too. I'll be walking you through 5 mindset shifts and emotional tools that have helped me handle conflict with more softness and more clarity and more self-trust. And we're going to be specifically talking about self-regulation, feminine composure, emotional misalignment, and how to express yourself without abandoning yourself. This isn't about being the perfect communicator. It's about walking away from hard conversations, still proud of who you were. And that's the energy we're going to be stepping into today. Now, if you are craving more tangible tools, I want you to stay tuned because next week's episode will be a solid conflict resolution toolkit, less mindset and more language and strategy that you can actually use in the moment. So stay tuned for that next week. Now, if you are listening on Spotify, I want you to scroll down and vote in this week's poll. Which part of conflict is hardest for you to navigate? A, is it staying regulated when you feel triggered? B, expressing how you feel without shutting down? Or C, communicating your needs clearly? Or D, letting go of being right? Or E, not taking things personally? I'd love to know what you guys struggle with because it does help me create more content that actually supports your emotional growth. So scroll down and vote and let me know. Now let's get into it. Now, I want to start with the one thing that almost nobody tells you, and that's the fact that power in conflict doesn't come from being the loudest person in the room, and it doesn't come from winning the argument or getting the other person to say you're right. And it definitely doesn't come from having a better comeback. Real power, the kind that actually matters in the long run, comes from being able to regulate yourself in the moment. It comes from choosing presence over performance, from staying rooted in who you are, even when someone else is trying to knock you off center. I used to think I was good at conflict because I could argue well, and it's true, I'm very stubborn. I was articulate, I was passionate, and I was really quick with words. And if I'm being honest, sometimes that meant I bulldozed people, especially when I felt misunderstood. But what I eventually realized is that being good at arguing doesn't mean you're emotionally mature. In fact, it can often be the opposite, because when you're relying on performance or cleverness or emotional intensity to prove your point, what you're actually doing is abandoning yourself in the process. You are chasing control, in essence. You're chasing certainty. You're chasing validation, but you're not rooted. And when you're not rooted, conflict becomes this high-stakes performance. You start to think that unless they see it your way, you're not safe. You're not respected. You're not heard. But let me ask you this. What if the goal of conflict isn't to be heard by the other person first, but to be deeply heard by yourself? That's what real power looks like. Power is, I can sit in discomfort without trying to dominate it. Power is, I don't need you to agree with me for me to feel at peace with what I believe. Or power is, I trust myself enough to know I don't have to lose myself to protect myself. And look, I'm not saying this from some pedestal, okay? There are still moments today where I can feel that adrenaline kick in, where I kind of just want to snap back and raise my voice or write a paragraph long text defending myself. But the more I've learned into emotional regulation as a form of self-respect, the more I've realized that the real flex is calm. Not silence, not submission, just calm. Just knowing who you are in the middle of the storm. And here's the thing that most people misunderstand. Conflict is not inherently bad, okay? It's actually neutral and it's just feedback. It's kind of a mirror that shows you what still triggers you and what still scares you, what still needs healing. Conflict is where our unresolved stuff shows up loud and uninvited, and how we respond to it, that's where the growth lives. But you can't respond from clarity if you're addicted to being right. You can't respond from your highest self if you're locked in survival mode, treating every disagreement like a threat to your identity. Sometimes power looks like staying quiet. Not because you're afraid, but because you've learned that you don't have to argue with someone who's committed to misunderstanding you. Sometimes it looks like just walking away, not as a punishment, but as an act of emotional hygiene. And sometimes power looks like saying, I'm not in the right state to talk to you about this calmly, and I don't want to say something that I'm going to regret. So can we pause and come back to this later? And that last one, that took me years to learn, because I used to think pausing meant weakness. Like I was backing down or giving up, but now I see it as a skill. Pausing gives your nervous system time to regulate. It creates space for wisdom to catch up to emotion. So if you're listening to this and thinking, I always lose control when I'm in conflict, or I shut down and then overthink everything I should have said, I hear you, okay? We've all been there. But here's your gentle reminder that you don't have to be perfect to be powerful. You just have to be present enough to catch yourself in the moment and choose a different response. That's it. That's literally the whole game. And maybe that's the most powerful thing of all, not needing the other person to change, apologize, or understand before you decide to stay regulated, grounded, and in alignment with who you want to be. Because at the end of the day, how you show up in conflict says less about the situation and more about your self-concept. So when you feel the urge to argue, defend, or lash out, pause and ask, who am I becoming right now? Not who's right, not how do I win this, but what energy am I reinforcing? What identity am I stepping into? That's how you redefine power. And that's how you stop reacting and start leading yourself. Now let's talk about a kind of strength that doesn't get nearly enough credit, and that's feminine composure, especially in the middle of conflict when everything in your body wants to react, retreat, or retaliate. Choosing composure in those moments might feel small on the outside, but it is massive on the inside. And it's one of the clearest markers of emotional maturity, and it's one of the most underrated forms of feminine power. Now, when I say feminine, I don't mean quiet, passive, or agreeable. I mean rooted in receptivity, intuition, and emotional depth. Feminine energy in conflict doesn't bulldoze, but it doesn't shrink either. It holds. It senses the emotional temperature of the room, and it knows when to soften and when to speak. And this is less about controlling the outcome and more about directing the energy with intention. See, composure is not performance. It's not pretending that you're unbothered, and it's definitely not bottling things up until you eventually explode. True composure is when you feel that heat rising and you feel the shakiness in your chest and you feel the sting of what they just said, but instead of spiraling, you stay with yourself and you breathe and you check in and you decide, I get to choose how to show up right now. That's what makes it powerful, because you're not being led by your ego. You're not being hijacked by emotion. You're anchored in self-awareness. And when you're anchored, you don't lose yourself in the fire. You become the fire. I remember a moment a few years ago where someone said something to me that was completely out of pocket, and they made a passive-aggressive comment, and I felt this immediate rush of heat in my body. And that familiar desire to defend myself, to clap back, put them in their place, that desire was still there, but I didn't. I stayed calm. I looked at them and said to myself that, you know what, I'm going to bring this up later. Then I went straight back to what I was doing, and the shift in the energy was instant. Not just in the room, but in me, because I knew old me would have matched their tone, I would have escalated it, and maybe even regretted it later. But that version of me, who was composed, clear, and collected, it wasn't fake. It came from growth. That's what composure does. It creates space between the stimulus and your response. And that space, that is where your power lives. Now, that doesn't mean you never get to express anger, and it doesn't mean you stay silent just to keep the peace. It means you take a beat. You regulate before you respond. You channel emotion with precision and not pressure. And that's such a distinct feminine form of strength. This ability to hold complexity, to feel deeply without leaking all over the place. Because listen, anyone can scream, anyone can snap, but not everyone can express with grace. Not everyone can set a boundary without turning it into a battlefield. Not everyone can say, that hurt me in a tone that's honest but not destructive. And I get it. Composure is hard, especially if you were raised in environments where emotional regulation wasn't modeled, or where anger was either explosive or suppressed. If that's the case, give yourself grace. This is just practice. It's not about never losing your cool. It's about catching yourself quicker each time and choosing to come back to center. Sometimes composure looks like walking out of the room to breathe. Sometimes it's saying, I'm not ready to have this conversation right now, but I care about resolving it and I'll come back to it when I can. That's not avoidance. That's self-responsibility. That's knowing your emotional bandwidth and honoring it. One of my favorite reframes is this. Composure isn't about being in control. It's about being in alignment. It's not about controlling them, the outcome, or even your feelings. It's about staying in alignment with the version of you that you respect. The version that doesn't abandon herself just to win. The version that values peace more than being right. The version that understands softness can be strategic. Because when you hold your center in the middle of emotional chaos, that is not weakness. That is leadership. You don't need to raise your voice to raise your standards. You don't need to be cold to be clear. And you don't need to fight fire with fire when you are the warmth, the flame, and the light. And when someone tries to pull you out of character and you don't let them, that is power right there. Quiet power. That kind that doesn't need to prove itself because it already knows. Now let's talk about something that quietly ruins more relationships than people realize. Emotional misalignment. You know those moments where you're trying to express something real, something vulnerable, and the other person responds with logic or facts or just doesn't get it? Or maybe you're the one trying to stay calm and rational, but the other person is getting more and more upset, and suddenly it feels like you're in two completely different conversations. That right there is called emotional misalignment, and it's one of the most frustrating, disconnecting experiences in any relationship, romantic or otherwise. I recently came across a quote that captured this perfectly in a TikTok by Alexandrina MindPro. She shared a story about a couples therapist from Montreal who had listened to over 1,000 recorded arguments, and he said, relationships don't break from conflict, they break from emotional misalignment. And I haven't been able to stop thinking about that. What he found after years of studying breathing patterns, tone, and micro reactions was that most couples, they weren't fighting each other. They were fighting from different nervous systems. One person would be arguing from fear and the other from logic. One wanted comfort, the other wanted clarity. But fear can't absorb logic, and logic can't soothe fear. So both people felt unheard even when they were trying to connect. And that completely stopped me in my tracks. Because how often do we assume that someone doesn't care just because they aren't responding the way we want them to? How often do we take a logical response as coldness or an emotional response as irrational, when really both are just different languages trying to say, I'm scared, I want to feel close to you again? One of the therapist's examples was a woman who said softly, I feel alone. And her partner responded immediately with, but I'm right here. very factual, very straightforward, but completely misattuned. She was expressing emotional isolation and he was answering a logistical question. And the therapist paused the recording and said to his students, "This is how love dies, not from cruelty, but from mismatched interpretations." And that line gave me chills because I've seen it. I've done it. I've been on both sides, trying to explain what I feel and being met with solutions, or being the one who thinks I'm fixing it by staying calm and factual and not realizing that what the other person needs is attunement, not advice. When you're in that space where two nervous systems are activated in different ways, it doesn't matter how smart you are, or how loving you are, or how many self-help books you've read. If you don't pause to check in with what emotional language is being spoken, you'll keep missing each other over and over and over again. And that's why I always say emotional maturity isn't about knowing the right thing to say. It's about knowing when connection is more important than being correct. And here's what I want you to remember. People aren't always reacting to what you said. They're reacting to what they felt in your tone, your pacing, and your energy. And that energy is often shaped by old patterns, by unspoken fears, literally childhood defenses that have nothing to do with the present moment. Now, the therapist in the story said something else that also really stayed with me, and it's the fact that we don't argue with the person in front of us. We argue with the version of ourselves that we're taught to be. And that one hit hard because sometimes the conflict isn't about what's happening right now. It's about what it's bringing up in us. The panic of being dismissed, the fear of being unlovable, the belief that anger means abandonment. And suddenly your adult conflict becomes a playground for your younger self's deepest insecurities. This is why regulation is such a game changer, because when you're regulated, you can start to notice emotional misalignment instead of getting swept into it. You can actually pause and ask, are we actually arguing about the same thing right now? Or is this fear looking for safety or logic trying to solve? You can also start shifting the conversation toward attunement. If they're in fear, logic won't land. So don't start with the solution. Start with something like, that sounds really overwhelming. I'm here, I'm listening, and I want to understand. And if you're the one in fear, don't fake composure just to keep the peace. Try saying, I'm feeling a little scared and I don't need a fix right now. I just need to feel like we're on the same page. I'm not mad. I'm just activated and I want to reconnect. And I know these phrases sound simple, but they can create a pattern interrupt, a way to shift out of the emotional static and into emotional safety. And once you're both in the same nervous system language, the conflict often resolves itself because now you're not fighting each other. You're fighting for each other. That's the shift, that's the work, and that's how emotional misalignment becomes emotional intimacy, with awareness, softness, and the courage to just slow down. Now, there's this thing so many of us, especially women, do in conflict. We tend to disappear, not physically, not completely, but emotionally, energetically. We start shrinking. We hold back what we really want to say. We make our tone softer than necessary. We avoid asking for what we need directly because we don't want to come off as too much. And the irony is, half the time we think we're keeping the peace when what we're really doing is abandoning ourselves. And I've done this more times than I can count. I have swallowed hard truths just to keep the vibe good. I have brushed off comments that actually stung because I didn't want to seem dramatic. I've softened my tone to protect someone else's comfort while completely ignoring my own discomfort. And what always happens? I walk away from those conversations with this quiet, lingering resentment, not toward them, but toward me, because I didn't speak up. I didn't honor what I actually felt. I edited myself to be more digestible. And that's not communication. That's self-abandonment. So this section is really about reclaiming your voice without letting it become a weapon. It's about expressing what's real without performing, without pleasing, and without letting your emotions run the entire show. Because emotional honesty doesn't mean emotional chaos. You can say that hurt me without screaming. You can say, I need something different from you right now without blaming. And you can say, this isn't working for me without guilt tripping or ghosting. The key is being emotionally precise. Not perfect, not polished, just clear. So instead of saying, you never listen to me, you can try, I feel really dismissed when I share something and it's brushed off. I know that might not be your intention, but that's how it lands. Or instead of saying you're so cold, try instead, When you get quiet during conflict, it makes me feel alone in the problem. I don't need a fix. I just need to know we're in this together. Do you see that shift? It's not about sugarcoating. It's about staying rooted in your experience without distorting theirs. That's what makes a conversation a bridge instead of a battlefield. And yes, it takes practice, especially if your nervous system is wired for people-pleasing or conflict avoidance. And you might feel shaky the first few times you try to express yourself honestly. That's okay. Shakiness doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It usually just means you're doing something new. And if you've been conditioned to put other people's comfort above your own truth, of course, speaking up feels threatening at first. But over time, your body learns that being honest doesn't equal being rejected, that using your voice doesn't make you unlovable. It actually makes you trust yourself more, and that trust becomes your anchor in every relationship. One thing I've learned is that clarity is kindness, not just for the other person, but for you. It's kind to stop expecting people to read your mind. It's kind to let yourself be seen fully, even if the other person doesn't react perfectly. And it's kind to walk away from a conversation knowing you showed up with honesty and care rather than silence and resentment. That being said, being honest doesn't mean you owe everyone full access to your emotional world. Boundaries matter too, and sometimes the most self-honoring thing you can say is, "I'm not ready to talk about this yet," or "This conversation doesn't feel safe for me right now, and I'd rather revisit it when we're both calmer." That's not avoidance, that is called discernment. It's the difference between shutting down and choosing not to bleed all over someone who won't hold it with care. So if you're in a season where you're learning to communicate better, I want you to be patient with yourself. You might stumble, you might over-explain, you might undershare at first. It's okay. The goal isn't to be perfect, it's to be honest without self-abandonment. Start small if you need to. One sentence, one clear feeling, one need named. And remember, if you're constantly editing your truth to keep someone else comfortable, that's not communication, that's performance. And no amount of peace is worth losing yourself in the process. Your voice doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. It just has to be yours. Lastly, so much of what we think of as conflict resolution is actually just ego management. It's wild how often we stay in a fight, not because we care about the topic anymore, but because we want to win. Because we don't want to be the one who backs down first, because we want to prove a point or make them feel what we felt, or even defend the part of us that feels small and unseen. And I get it. Truly, I do get it. There have been so many moments where I've said things not from clarity, but from ego, from the need to be right, from that ache for validation, from the part of me that just couldn't stand the idea of losing the argument. But here's what I've learned the hard way. You can win the argument and still lose the connection. You can make your point perfectly, hit every logical note, and still walk away feeling hollow. Because in the process of trying to win, you left your integrity behind. You abandoned the version of you that values grace, softness, maturity. You protected your pride, but you didn't protect the relationship. And that's the real loss. Integrity in conflict looks different than most people think. It's not about being passive, and it's not about rolling over or giving in. It's about staying rooted in your values, even when your ego is screaming at you to go low. It's about choosing to be the version of yourself you respect, even when you're hurt, even when you're angry, even when the other person doesn't deserve your grace. That's hard, especially if you're used to equating strength with dominance, or silence with punishment, or even boundaries with power plays. But what if strength is actually the ability to de-escalate? What if power is being able to say, this isn't about being right, it's about being real? What if the ultimate win is walking away with your self-respect intact? For me, integrity sounds like this. I care about this conversation and I don't want to ruin it by speaking from a reactive place. Can we take a break for a moment? Or this is hard for me to say calmly, so I'm going to take a moment before I respond. Or, I love you, but I can't keep having the same conversation in a way that hurts us both. I'm willing to revisit this when we're both ready to speak from a place of care. Everything I just said is not weakness, it's leadership. And honestly, that is very attractive energy in friendships, in romantic dynamics, in any relationship where mutual respect matters. Because here's the truth, people remember how you made them feel in conflict more than they remember the actual words you said. They remember the tone, They remember the energy, whether they felt safe or small, or whether they felt seen or steamrolled. And you'll remember too. You'll remember if you walked away proud of who you were, or if you let your worst instincts take the mic. Sometimes we don't realize how far we've come until we're in the middle of a disagreement and we do the exact opposite of what we used to. Maybe you pause, maybe you ask a question instead of making an assumption. Maybe you speak your truth without trying to control how the other person takes it. And in that moment, even if nothing changes externally, you changed, you grew, you chose integrity over ego. That choice doesn't always get instant rewards because the other person might not thank you and they might still be defensive, but that's okay because integrity isn't about being recognized, it's about being aligned. It's about knowing I didn't betray myself to feel powerful, or I didn't weaponize my words to feel heard, or I stayed rooted in the version of me I'm proud to be. And the more you practice this, the more you start to notice how light it feels to not carry resentment, how peaceful it feels to not need to be right all the time, how freeing it is to say, this is what I believe, this is what I value. And I don't need to raise my voice or lower my standards to prove that. That's the energy that changes relationships, not because you're forcing anyone to change, but because you're raising the frequency of how you show up. So the next time you feel yourself slipping into pettiness or pride or performance in conflict, ask yourself this: what would integrity do here? Not ego, not fear, and not the inner teenager who wants to win at all costs. What would integrity do? Then choose that, even if it's quiet, even if it's not flashy, and even if it feels vulnerable, because that's where the real power lives. Not in being right, but in being whole. And that's a wrap on today's episode. I hope this gave you a new lens on conflict, one that centers self-respect over control and clarity over chaos, because the truth is, it's not about having the perfect response. It's about staying grounded in who you are, even when emotions run high. Conflict doesn't have to cost you your peace. You can stay regulated and you can express yourself without abandoning yourself, and you can walk away knowing you stayed in integrity, even if the other person didn't meet you there. And again, if you're craving more tangible tools, stay tuned because next week's episode will be a solid conflict resolution toolkit. Less mindset, more language and strategy you can actually use in the moment. Now, if this resonated with you, I'd love if you shared it with someone who's doing the inner work too. And if you're listening on Spotify, don't forget to scroll down and answer the poll. I genuinely want to know what hit home for you the most. To everyone who made it this far, I appreciate you so, so much. And I can't wait to chat with you again in next week's episode. Lots of love, Parmis.